England, 1509. A kingdom trembling beneath the weight of a new king's ambition. Henry VIII has just ascended the throne, young, golden, intoxicating in his promise. The court of England is not merely a gathering of nobles, it is a theater of survival. Every glance carries calculation. Every smile conceals a blade. In the gilded halls of Greenwich Palace, where tapestries muffle screams and music drowns confession, fortunes rise and fall not through battle alone, but through proximity, through blood, through desire. The Boleyn family understands this better than most. Thomas Boleyn, a man of relentless ambition dressed in the robes of a diplomat, has staked everything on one singular strategy: his children. His daughters, in particular. For in a court where a king's eye is the most dangerous and most coveted thing in the world, a beautiful daughter is currency. She is leverage. She is sacrifice dressed in silk. There are two daughters. The world will come to know one of them. History will carve her name into its darkest chapters. Anne Boleyn, the woman who would topple a queen, fracture a church, and place her own neck beneath the executioner's axe. But Anne is not the first. Anne is not the one who learned early and at devastating cost what it meant to be used, discarded, and yet somehow impossibly survive. That is the story of Mary. Mary Boleyn, the forgotten daughter, the unseen sister, the woman who vanished so thoroughly from history that her absence itself has become the mystery. Where did she go? How did a woman who shared a bed with a king end up erased from the very narrative she helped create? The answer lies not in death, but in something far rarer in the Tudor court. Something almost miraculous. Mary Boleyn chose herself. And in doing so, she disappeared from a world that had never truly seen her at all. To understand where Mary went, we must first understand where she came from. And to understand that, we must enter a world built entirely on appearances, where the most dangerous thing a woman could do was be noticed, and the second most dangerous thing was be forgotten. Mary Boleyn lived her entire life navigating that impossible space between invisibility and ruin. This is her story. Born around 1500, the exact date lost. Like so much of her life, to deliberate or careless erasure, Mary Boleyn entered the world as the eldest daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Lady Elizabeth Howard. The Howard name carried weight, aristocratic lineage on her mother's side, diplomatic cunning from her father. Mary was not simply born into a family. She was born into a machine. Thomas Boleyn was a man who read opportunity the way sailors read wind. He had cultivated favor at the court of Henry VII and understood with cold precision what the new reign of Henry VIII would demand: charm, youth, strategic display. The Boleyn children were not raised so much as deployed. Foreign courts, language, lessons, the art of the lute, the geometry of court dance. These were not luxuries. They were weapons. In 1514, Mary accompanied the newly crowned French queen, young Mary Tudor, to the French court of Louis XII. She was perhaps 13 or 14. Europe was watching. Paris glittered. And in that dazzling, dangerous world of the French court, a place even more treacherous than the English one, Mary Boleyn received an education no classroom could provide. She learned to read men. She learned to read rooms. She learned that her beauty was a door that opened easily, but closed behind her with violence. The French court was notorious. Pleasure and politics intertwined without apology. The young king, Francis I, who ascended the throne in 1515 after Louis XII's death, was infamous for his appetites. Mary Boleyn, now approaching her mid-teens, beautiful and foreign and therefore fascinating, would later be described in the most damning of terms. Francis himself, years later, would refer to her with words that strip away all pretense, calling her in essence a woman of easy virtue. A slur, yes. Something that would define how men perceived Mary Boleyn for the rest of her life. What actually occurred in those French years will never be fully known. What we do know is that Mary returned to England changed, quieter, perhaps, or perhaps simply more practiced in silence. She had learned something essential in France. that her power and her vulnerability were identical. The same quality that drew powerful men to her was the same quality that made her disposable to them. She was beautiful. She was obedient. For a time, everything the court required. And then she came home to face a king who was even more dangerous than the one she had left behind. By 1519, Mary Boleyn had married William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, pleasant, well-connected, quietly ambitious, became her husband in a ceremony attended by the king himself. This attendance was not sentiment. It was signal. Neitha was already watching. Mary Boleyn. The affair began not long after. History records it obliquely, as it always does with women it would prefer to ignore. There are no love letters. There's no poetry from a king to Mary as there would later be to Anne. What exists are the grants, the patents, the sudden elevation of William Carey's fortunes, the lands given, the offices conferred. In the Tudor court, royal favor expressed itself in coin and property, and the coin flowed toward the Carey household with suspicious generosity. Mary Boleyn was Henry VIII's mistress. The duration is contested, perhaps for years, perhaps longer. She bore 2 children during this period, Catherine Carey in 1524 and Henry Carey in 1526. Whether either child was fathered by Henry VIII is one of history's most tantalizing open questions. Henry himself never acknowledged paternity, but he acknowledged Henry Carey decades later, granting him favor. And the resemblance whispered about in court was not something easily dismissed. For Mary, these years were gilded captivity. She was elevated and endangered simultaneously. The king's attention was the most valuable and most perilous commodity in England. She could not refuse. She could not negotiate. She could not, in any meaningful sense, consent. She was the daughter of an ambitious father, the wife of a compliant husband, and the mistress of a king who had not yet learned restraint. She had no script for survival except the one the court had written for her. Endure, please, submit, and hope that what came after was livable. What came after was her sister. Around 1526, Henry's eye began its catastrophic drift toward Anne. Anne Boleyn, brilliant, dark, educated in the same French courts as Mary, but transformed by them differently, had returned to England with something Mary lacked, or perhaps had long since abandoned, the will to make a king wait. Anne withheld herself. She negotiated. She refused to become another Mary, another beautiful, discarded vessel for royal pleasure. She demanded marriage or nothing. And Henry astonishingly chose marriage. The world cracked along its seam. Mary Boleyn was set aside. Not cruelly, not publicly, but utterly. The years between 1527 and 1533 were the years of Anne Boleyn's inexorable ascent and Mary Boleyn's quiet eclipse. While Henry mounted his devastating campaign to dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, while Anne maneuvered through every legal and spiritual crisis with breathtaking intelligence, Mary watched from the margins of a stage that had once held her at its center. She was still present at court. She could hardly have been absent. Her sister was becoming queen. The Boleyn family was reaching the summit of English ambition. Thomas Boleyn was elevated to the earldom of Wiltshire. George Boleyn, their brother, rose rapidly in royal favor. Even the family motto, now whispered with new significance, carried the scent of triumph. Inxi sira, groini qui groini. It will be thus, grumble who may. The Boleyns had arrived, but Mary's position was fundamentally altered. She had been the king's mistress. Now her sister would be his queen. The geometry of this was impossible to resolve without humiliation. Henry treated Mary with the polite distance of a man erasing inconvenient history. Her husband, William Carey, died in 1528 of sweating sickness, leaving Mary a widow with 2 young children in a financial situation that was, by contemporary accounts, precarious. She appealed to an IV support. Anne, to her credit, secured a penchant for her sister, but the dynamic was clear. Mary was now dependent on the woman who had replaced her. The sister she had perhaps once protected, guided, proceeded, now dispensed charity from a height Mary would never reach. What did Mary feel? History grants her no interior monologue. She left no diaries. She wrote no letters that survive from this period in her own hand. We are left to read her through the actions of others, the grants given and withheld, the positions offered and denied. What we can say is this: Mary was not broken. There is no evidence of collapse, of disgrace beyond the acceptable, of bitterness expressed publicly. She endured the transition from royal mistress to royal sibling in waiting with a composure that either masked extraordinary anguish or represented something even more remarkable, genuine equanimity. By the time Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in June 1533, Mary Boleyn occupied a peculiar space. She was the Queen's sister. She was the King's former lover. She was a widow with children of uncertain paternity and a modest income secured only through Anne's generosity. She was, in every measurable sense, dependent, managed, contained, and then Mary Boleyn did something none of it had prepared anyone for. She chose love. The man's name was William Stafford. He was a soldier, a minor gentleman. He owned no great estate, carried no title that mattered, possessed not a single quality that Thomas Boleyn's careful ambition would have recognized as valuable. He was not rich. He was not powerful. He was not connected to any faction that could advance the Boleyn cause. He was, by every measure, the Tudor court applied to human worth. Nobody, Mary Boleyn, married him in secret sometime in 1534. She was already pregnant when the marriage was discovered. The court did not whisper. It erupted. The scandal was of a particular and devastating kind, not merely that Mary had married without the king's permission, which was required of all royal intimates, but that she had married so far beneath her station after having stood so close to the throne. The insult felt calculated, even if it was simply the act of a woman who had spent too long being calculated by others. Anne Boleyn was furious. Thomas Boleyn was reportedly beside himself. The Queen, already navigating the razor's edge of Henry's accelerating disillusionment, did not need this particular scandal attached to her family name. Mary was banished from court. The expulsion was not gentle. It was complete. She and William Stafford were sent away, removed from the only world Mary had ever known. Stripped of position and pension, left to manage on Stafford's modest means, Mary wrote one surviving letter from this period, one extraordinary document that illuminates, in a flash, everything her silence had concealed. She wrote to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, the man who managed the impossible, asking for his intercession, begging for her pension to be restored. But the letter is not merely a plea, it is a declaration. She says with stunning directness that she loved Stafford, that she would rather beg her bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom, that for once in her life she had done what she wanted rather than what others demanded of her. Read those words carefully. Read them against the backdrop of everything that came before. A woman who was offered to a French king, who became an English king's mistress without any evidence of willing participation, who watched her husband die, who watched her sister rise, who was pensioned off like a household expense. And then she chose. She chose a man who would gain nothing from her. She chose love. She chose obscurity. She chose, for the first time in her recorded life, herself. While Mary lived in quiet exile with William Stafford, the world she had left behind was consuming itself. Henry VIII's passion for Anne Boleyn had long since curdled. Anne had failed to produce a son. She had miscarried. She had argued. She had survived through brilliance alone for years, but brilliance, in the end, was not sufficient currency against a king whose love had transformed into something cold and purposeful. 1536 arrived with the violence of a closing trap. Thomas Cromwell, the same man Mary had petitioned for mercy, now moved against the Queen with surgical precision. Charges were drawn up: adultery, incest, treason. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated. Historians have debated endlessly, but the consensus leans toward manufactured conspiracy rather than factual guilt. Anne was not merely removed, she was destroyed. Her fall was designed to leave nothing behind that could become a rallying point. George Boleyn, Mary's brother, was arrested alongside Anne. He was accused of incest, of having an affair with the Queen herself. The charge was almost certainly false. George's wife, Jane Boleyn, was said to have provided testimony against him, a detail history has never forgiven her for. Though the truth of even this accusation remains muddied, George was executed. Anne was executed. In the space of weeks, the summit of Boleyn power became its gravesite. Mary was not there to watch. She was in the country, banished, removed. The very expulsion that had seemed like punishment may, in retrospect, have saved her life. Had she still been at court, attached to Anne's household, intimate with the Queen, she might have been drawn into the vortex. She might have been questioned. She might have been useful to Cromwell as a witness, or dangerous as a loyalist. Instead, she was irrelevant, too far away, too unimportant, thoroughly discarded to be worth destroying. The irony is almost unbearable. The decision Mary made, the one that cost her everything, that saw her dismissed as foolish and shameless, was the decision that kept her breathing while her brilliant, calculating, extraordinary sister bled on Tower Green. Love had not destroyed Mary Boleyn. Love had, against all logic of the world she inhabited, saved her. After Anne's execution in May 1536, Mary Boleyn drops almost entirely from the historical record. This disappearance is not mysterious in the dramatic sense. It is the disappearance of a woman who no longer exists within the documents that power generates about itself. Mary had no position at court to generate records. She had no political faction producing correspondence about her movements. She had no enemy powerful enough to create testimony against her. She simply lived. And in the Tudor world, living quietly was paradoxically the most radical thing she ever did. She and William Stafford settled in Essex, at the manor of Rochford Hall, which had come to Mary after her father's death in 1539, when Thomas Boleyn, broken and discarded after Anne's fall, finally surrendered to mortality. The man who had deployed his children as pieces in a great game outlived two of them, only to die diminished, his earldom stripped of its luster, his legacy permanently complicated by the fates of the children he had used so coldly. Mary lived. At Rochford Hall, she raised her children, Catherine and Henry Carey, whose parentage remained a whispered question, and the two children she had with William Stafford, Anne Stafford and Edward Stafford. There is evidence she managed the estate competently. There are records of ordinary legal disputes, ordinary property matters, the ordinary business of a woman managing a household in the English countryside. This, after everything, was her life. It was not the life the Tudor court had destined her for. It was something rarer, a life she had chosen. She died in 1543. She was perhaps 43 years old. Cause is unrecorded. There was no state funeral, no elaborate monument, no elegy from the court that had once consumed her. She was buried in the church at Rochford in Essex, away from London, away from the towers and the tapestries, away from the machinery of ambition that had used her and discarded her, and in the end, failed to kill her. William Stafford survived her by many years. He remarried, lived a long life. Whatever their marriage had been, and whatever Mary's motives in entering it, there is no record of regret on his side. He had lived with a woman who had survived everything the most dangerous court in Christendom could attempt, likely. Understood in ways few people ever would. Exactly how extraordinary that was. Mary Boleyn did not vanish from history because she was unimportant. She vanished because importance in the world she inhabited was fatal. And she had finally, late at devastating cost, learned to become unimportant. To disappear not into death, but into life. Mary Boleyn left no dramatic final speech. She built no empire. She led no army. She changed no theology and toppled no queen. By every standard the Tudor era used to measure consequence, she was marginal. And yet the lives she produced, the blood she carried forward, would echo through centuries in ways not even the most ambitious Boleyn could have planned. Her son, Henry Carey, became Baron Hunsdon and Lord Chamberlain of England under Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the daughter of the king who may or may not have fathered him. He served Elizabeth faithfully for decades. Her daughter Catherine Carey became a close intimate of Elizabeth herself, a lady of the bedchamber, one of the Queen's most trusted companions. If Henry VIII was indeed their father, then Elizabeth I spent her life surrounded by siblings she could acknowledge only in silence. The Carey line did not stop there. Through Catherine Carey descended a remarkable thread of English and eventually American history, including, by some genealogical accounts, connections that stretch forward in ways that make Mary Boleyn one of the most quietly consequential women of the Tudor age. Not because of what she did in the great chambers of power, but because of the children she raised and the survival she engineered for them in obscurity. History has not been kind to Mary Boleyn, or rather, history has been the wrong kind of kind. It has sentimentalized her, reduced her to the prettier, weaker, less interesting sister, the one who was used and then forgotten. But this reading misses something essential. In a world where every other person she was close to either died violently, was imprisoned, was destroyed by royal favor, or was consumed by their own ambition, Mary Boleyn lived. She buried a king's love for her. She buried a husband. She buried her position. She watched her sister die and her father wither and her brother perish on fabricated charges. She kept living. In the country, with a man she had chosen. A house that was hers. This is not the absence of a story. This is the story. In the Tudor court, where the price of power was almost always paid in blood, where brilliance and beauty and ambition all led to Tower Hill, Mary Boleyn chose the one thing that none of them chose. She chose to stop playing. And in stepping off that terrible board, she won a game that everyone around her lost. The question was never where Mary Boleyn disappeared to. The question all along was whether we were willing to recognize that what